Okay, great. And you would prefer to go first, or you would prefer to go second? Yep, then that's what we'll do. Okay, great. Okay.
Oops.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I think we'll just wait for 1 or 2 minutes more to have other people join us.
Hello, Sophie. Are you in New York now?
Not yet, unfortunately. I'm still in Belgium. And it might be harder to get there, actually, because there's a snowstorm coming up. But oh well.
Your way there is complicated.
Yes, for sure.
Emma and Sophie, next time could you arrange to have some supermarket background music?
Some loungy jazz.
Ignacio, if you could do the honors and just provide some humming, I'd be very grateful.
All right, so I think we're good to start. We have about 74 people registered for this webinar, so I'm expecting more people to join us later, but I'm very wary of the time, so I think we should just start. So before going into the agenda and the objective of today's call, just a few technical announcements. So I see most of you have already done that, but thank you so much for muting yourself when you're not speaking. Especially since we'll have more people on the call, it would be better for the sound quality. And then when we open up for Q&A in some of the sections of the agenda, you're definitely free to ask your question by unmuting yourself, but you can also type up a question in the chat box and we'll make sure to read your question out loud. We have our great colleagues Emer and Athena in ICMC Geneva are also helping with that. So yeah, let's start this webinar. First of all, thank you so much for all of you joining us today. It was really interesting to have a look at the list of organizations and people that have registered. We really have a very diverse list of organizations, mainly working at the national level, from all over the world. So that's really nice to see, and I'd be really looking forward to hearing your intel or take on the GCM process from your national context. But since we have a little bit of a diverse group of organizations that have already been involved in the process and others who have only recently started engaging, the real objective of this call will be first to share a little bit more information about the process and about the Zero Draft and the second Zero Draft Plus that has just been released, and also to give you some more information about civil society engagement in this process right now in the negotiations, and maybe look at a little bit at ways and how you could get involved or get engaged. But before we dive into the agenda, I'd really like to give the floor to Ignacio Packer, who was one of the two chairs of the civil society gathering ahead of the Puerto Vallarta stock-taking conference, and who is also, as the executive director of ICFA, the co-convener of the Civil Society Action Committee, for just a few words of inspiration and vision going forward in this webinar and in this process.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. I'll try a few words, but really welcoming, I think, a number of people who are not necessarily in the regular loop of the discussions around the Action Committee, and that's why this webinar is so useful. And actually, the comments I'll make at the beginning is also very much to say, well, some of our colleagues in our organizations are working on the global compacts, but they haven't yet realized it. And it's so important to connect with them. So my inputs are very much looking at perhaps the connecting dots on a bigger picture before we dive in. What are we doing in the coming days, weeks? The next negotiations are right spot on the key question that we have. It's not formulated that way, but the key question we have is, who is going to fall through the cracks of the two global compacts? Who are the refugees, migrants in vulnerable situations that are not going to benefit from the additional protection framework of the Global Compact on Refugees or the Global Compact for Migration? And that is also based on the first negotiations in New York, where some member states would try and squeeze the target group of the Global Compact for Migration, even some saying it's for regular migrants. So that clearly is the challenge, and the co-chairs certainly have taken it on board, putting as the differentiation between irregular and regular migrants a key point, but also the differentiation between migrants and refugees. Now, connecting with other discussions, and perhaps some of the people participating in this webinar are perhaps on these issues and not necessarily focused on the global compacts. One is the triple nexus. Yes, sorry, additional stuff. But this is the nexus between humanitarian development and peace. And on the drivers of migration and displacement, they have to be viewed under the lenses of the triple nexus. And often we forget the element of peace. And in the second draft of the Global Compact on Migration, there are several elements where we should be looking at on that nexus. So not only humanitarian development, but also the peace part of it. To keep in mind that there's a high-level meeting, really high level, with top members of state on peace building in New York on the 24th and 25th of April. That's also a way of bringing in the discussion of the global compacts. The second one is on the UN reform. As probably many of you know, the Guterres, the new UN Secretary General, has launched a UN reform. This is, of course, key for the discussions that we are having on the Global Compact for migration, because what is the implication for civil society in the discussions on the UN reform? And there are implications for migrants and migration. If there are questions and more for that, I'm happy to bring it. I'm just running through my points. The third element that I wanted to bring is when we connect between the two global compacts, more and more I realize that we have to be talking about the funding and the connection between the two global compacts, and using arguments that prevention is more expensive than cure or treatment. And all the discussion on regular and non-regular and the regularization should also be seen through the eyes of how is all this being funded. And there is the big discussion going on how the SDGs are being funded, but there is a connection also on funding between the two global compacts. And then my final point is how it is so important to connect with regional bodies. We saw in the in the negotiations in New York, the first round for the Global Compact for Migration, how strong the African Union was. But here I can take an example on the issue of statelessness, legal documentation, birth registration, and the Arab context. Today with ICVA, I had a meeting with the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, with the ambassador in Geneva, specifically discussing around statelessness, things that there are in the plan of action of the Global Compact on Refugees, but that we also have specifically as an objective on the Global Compact for migration. In the meantime, one of my colleagues was discussing in Dubai with the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, and this is to try and get these actors also motivated to talk about specific points on the Global Compacts, and here is around statelessness, legal documentation, and birth registration. I was last week in an interministerial meeting on belonging and legal identity organized by the League of Arab States, and certainly things are not that simple. And then perhaps a last word to say how important it is that we really embrace complementary advocacy between us, but also with individual voices, member states, the business community, and other actors, well, mainly also UN agencies. Those were my inputs, and I hope that wasn't too long, Sophie.
No, Ignacio, thank you so much. It was really excellent in really painting that bigger picture and how we move in our daily work across some of these themes and how the Global Compact, both of the Global Compacts are actually interconnected to them. And I think some of the main issues that you mentioned really link to some of the bigger questions that civil society also needs to work on and think on as we move in these negotiations, such as implementation, follow-up, review, funding. So this is definitely something I'd like to also hear some feedback on from the people on the call as well. So yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I think it was really perfect to set the tone. So what we'll do next is we'll go through the zero draft and the first round of negotiations, and then look a little bit at the second draft that was published the 5th of March, and the way the co-facilitators, Switzerland and Mexico, have envisioned the next negotiation round to take shape, which will be a little bit different than the first round in February. But maybe just a few words of information about the process for those of you who are not so familiar. So the process to develop the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration is now in its third phase, being the phase of international intergovernmental negotiations. And it's a little bit of a different game now than it was in 2017, where the phase of the consultation phase and stock-taking phase really were meant to gather input from a wide diversity of stakeholders, states, but also civil society, the private sector, UN agencies, on what such a zero draft at least should look like. So the game is a little bit different now. It's taking place in New York. It's relatively close for civil society organizations, and we have Colin Raja, who's the IOM Civil Society Liaison, with us on the call today, and he'll also shed a little bit more light on how civil society could get engaged in the formal process. So it's a little bit of a different game than what we had last year. So a lot of the center of gravity for our advocacy will turn more and more to the national and the regional level for direct advocacy in capitals. So the process to develop the Global Compact is taking place from February to July, with 1 week of intergovernmental negotiations every month. The first one took place the second week of February, and the next round is taking place next week in New York. In between each of the rounds, the co-facilitators, Mexico and Switzerland, will develop a new draft. Interestingly, what they've done now is they haven't published a new draft, but they've published an updated zero draft, a zero draft plus. And actually, Mon Ami will talk us a little bit through that later on in the agenda. So maybe starting with a little bit of a sense of that round one and of that zero draft. So I think when hearing feedback from the different civil society groups and coalitions that are working on this, the zero draft was really considered to be a comprehensive document, having a lot of rights-based wording in there, with some of the issues that civil society at least has been fighting for relatively well represented throughout the document, such as numerous references to firewalls, reference to regularization, and reference to increase of regular pathways, access to services, etc. We've been hearing some critiques, of course, from civil society on some of the issues that are maybe underdeveloped in the zero draft, such as access to justice, the right to privacy, and data sharing, just to name a few. Another one of the critiques that we've heard is the kind of the thin section on implementation and follow-up and review. But I think the overall assessment was that the zero draft was quite positive, and of course I'd be willing to hear from you on the call as well what you thought. In terms of impressions from that first round of negotiations, we had an ambitious zero draft, but I think the negotiations really turned political quite quickly in the negotiations, with a few states strongly opposing some of the issues that were mentioned in the zero draft. And of course, we had Hungary in the first day really speaking up strongly against some of the basic elements that were set out in the New York Declaration, which then, of course, also jeopardized the entire European Union in its common position in the rest of the negotiations. We had the African bloc really speaking very united, strongly. We had the Latin American countries very vocal and very much taking on a human rights-based approach through their statements. I didn't find there were that many governments really sharing a lot of practical and practical mechanisms of how to implement some of the issues that were mentioned in the zero draft. So this is something that civil society, I think, could maybe push for a little bit more. But yeah, I think these are a few thoughts already from my side, and I'd be happy to hear more input from those of you on the call. But before doing that, I'd like to invite Mon Ami to give us a sense of the second draft, or the zero draft plus document that was published earlier this week, and maybe give a bit of a sense of how the co-facilitators are planning to schedule or to shape the week of the negotiations, and maybe highlighting some of the worries or concerns that some of the civil society organizations or groups have with the different issues that are put forward in that program of work. So Mon Ami, the floor is yours.
I was muted. Sure, thank you. Sophie, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Sure. So thank you for that, Ignacio and Sophie. And so I'll just add on about, I'm sure most of you have seen the Zero Draft Plus, and I think in some sense there is an understanding that the co-facilitators have played it quite strategically in almost not acknowledging this as negotiations per se that have begun. And in fact, some of the comments from the floor states in the first round was a bit of frustration about the format, which was often in more of a style of consultations, statements, rather than sort of a continued discussion or debate on a theme in the first round. And so in that sense, it makes sense. And I think from a civil society perspective, there was a lot of fear in the room, as Sophie mentioned, as tensions built over the few days that week in February, that we would lose some of the really hard fought language through the consultations last year that were included in the Zero Draft, particularly on rights rights regardless of status, as well as mixed flows and non-refoulement, and firewalls and other areas. But luckily that did not happen, and the facilitators in the Zero Draft Plus, what they call, really changed very little. I think some of the key areas, actually, in some areas there was some strengthening or clarity given. So for instance, there was an addition of reference to the ICCPR, International Convention on Economic and Social Rights, and the Paris Agreement and Sendai framework. Some of the guiding principles were strengthened or clarified as well in some aspects. And then I think something in terms of recruitment and labor migration, there was a little bit more put into a few objectives around those aspects that make it stronger. However, there were, I think, also several places where there were strengthening of language around sovereignty and the use of bilateral and multilateral agreements over what were more so referred to as model agreements in the first draft. So that's some of the content difference of the Zero Draft Plus, but I think, as mentioned before, I think for some of us it was not alarming at all that the central sort of debate and really contentious issue was that of regular and irregular migrants. It's something that's been developing for quite a while, and really since the first thematic consultation last year, where the EU's really been codifying the idea of the legally staying migrants. And so, as mentioned, there are many, not just the EU, but as well as South Africa and other states as well, really took that division to heart, and what it means, particularly in terms of access to services and social benefits, which services, and of course the Latin American bloc for the most part, emphasizing rights for all regardless of status. The distinction between refugees and migrants was also a central issue, that clearer definitions are needed. Who's a refugee and migrant, and this was again a cross-section of different regions, so of course from the EU, Australia, some Asian countries, but also Lebanon and Jordan particularly, and Egypt. And so firewalls, of course, was a sort of a even more heated element of all of this. And so I think what, in the civil society side, I think there was a very good presence in the first round, a cross-regional presence again. And we made, I think, some statements, but beyond statements as well, into really having good bilateral and sort of multilateral meetings with governments and advocating for rights-based practices and policies, especially where they already exist. For example, on firewalls, it's what the cluster group on firewalls is developing right now, without having to call it firewalls, and really talking about it with states in ways that make sense, that we can get some champions and allies to work behind the scenes. I think it's also a sense that the co-facilitators are sort of keeping their cards close to their chest, and although they have the pen to draft, that they're really waiting to see in the room where the red lines are beyond sort of some of the rhetoric that's being articulated, and that we may not really get a sense of the meat of the issue and what will really remain and be cut out or change until about April or so. So yeah, I mean, I'll wrap up there, but of course to say, I think with a lot of our colleagues, particularly focusing on the national level advocacy, particularly in the European countries, it's going to be very critical also to stay in engagement and cross conversation with our civil society partners, particularly in Africa, as well as MENA region, and of course Asia and Latin America as well, because the way these regional bloc positions are being developed is going to be really critical and a place where we can leverage, but also really keeping an eye at the European-African relationship in terms of development aid and the strong push around border externalization, and of course pushbacks and readmission agreements, and what and how we need to really sort of support African society groups and human rights-based groups in that dynamic.
Thank you so much, Monami, and for that super comprehensive overview, and for already also pointing maybe to a few ways of which civil society could be working together. And this is definitely something that we want to look at on the third agenda item in terms of what civil society is doing and how we could strategically connect what we're doing. And thank you also for highlighting kind of these differences or the different areas that the co-facilitators are planning to look at in the next round of negotiations. And I would agree that I think we'll only get a sense of what will be really the sticky issues in a later stage of the process when the co-facilitators are really kind of cutting out certain areas. And that's like linking back to what Ignacio was saying, that's really where we'll have to look at what are the issues or who are the migrants that risk falling outside of both of the processes as well. So I'll stop here. I'd really like to open the floor now for any reaction, question, impressions, intelligence that you would have from your national or capital work. So the floor is entirely open. So you can unmute yourself and just ask a question or drop a question in the chat box. Maybe if I could start, I was wondering if there are any organizations on the call that work in the European member states, and to get a little bit of a sense of that dynamic over there, because I think that was really a region that was a little bit demobilized in the first round of negotiation. And I was wondering if there's any intelligence on how these conversations are moving. For example, in the case of Hungary, or some of the more pro-migration countries, such as Germany, for example.
Hey, this is Tamar speaking from the Czech Republic. So I thought I could give a bit of an insight on the Visegrad countries' position, if that's welcome.
That would be wonderful. Thanks, Tamar.
I was just having a meeting last night with a Ministry of Interior official, and was able to get some information on the Visegrad state's position. As you were saying, obviously Hungary is the troublemaker at this point, and they have made it quite public and also political that they will try to really bring down all of the principles that the civil society is trying to preserve in the whole Global Migration Compact. However, as it seems, this is not being explicitly supported by the other Visegrad countries. So to a large degree at this point, it seems Hungary is somehow alone in this attempt, which means that actually in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, what we are seeing is rather an attempt to keep the discussions technical, keep the whole process in very low political profile so that it wouldn't get hijacked by some political forces who might tend to join the Hungarian radical position. Therefore it doesn't seem that they would be openly supporting also this on the EU regional negotiations level. But of course, I mean, Hungary has made this very strong step forward, and it can by itself break the European consensus.
And it's Daniela here. Maybe I can bring in some intel that I got from the UK.
Yes, please, Daniela, go ahead.
Yes, hi everyone from Save the Children. So I met yesterday with Home Office, DFID and Foreign Office. They all together have created this interdepartmental group working on the compact. So I spoke to the ones that are specifically looking at the migration compact, and they were talking about the Hungary case, obviously, which was for them worrying, and that it obviously created a problem and a precedent in the negotiation kind of dynamics, because, as you know, the EU had given very, very clear steer as that there would be just one consensual position, and the Hungary situation just broke it. So my understanding from them was that they, from the UK, their preference is to continue to negotiate as part of the EU, which is I think it suits their priorities, national priorities, but they also said that the Hungary situation has put the EU in a very, very difficult political position, because they will need now to understand how they're going to put forward a position that is not, you know, bringing together all member states, but there is one that is being isolated. So it might be that that will mean that EU member states might be given potentially the permission to negotiate on their national capacity, but that will need to be resolved at EU level. So they're waiting to see how this is going to evolve, which I thought was a very interesting perspective. Yeah, and potentially quite dangerous as well, because it might be that, you know, there will be different alliances being formed at that point. The other thing I wanted to mention, maybe Mon Ami and the group that is looking at firewalls, there is a clear red line from the UK, but also from other states on language on firewalls. So they've asked explicitly to us suggestions on language that doesn't mention firewalls, but could be agreeable. So if anything has been produced, it would be great if that could be shared, because we've been asked to send them something by the next couple of days. Over.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And it was actually interesting what you said on member states being able to negotiate on their own, leaving behind the EU kind of common position. And I think the sense in the first round of negotiations was that could be potentially a good thing for European NGOs trying to work with the more progressive member states to have them speak out on some of the policies that they're already doing.
Thank you. Initially, though, I said with
yeah, exactly.
a lot.
Yeah, other questions, comments? I see there's a few questions in the chat box, so I'll read them out loud. So standard question from Stefan Rother is there any clarity on how the compact will exactly be agreed upon? To my knowledge, it's not even clear how the co-facilitators are going to incorporate the different inputs that they receive throughout the rounds of negotiations. So that's something to see, I think, not in this round, but in the next round when the first draft will appear. But if anyone else on the call, maybe Colin has some thoughts on that, feel free to jump in.
Thanks, Sophie. I think that's a tough one. It's in general, the idea is to reach consensus. As with any negotiated document, that's why you have so many rounds of negotiations to ensure that by the time we reach the July, the idea is to have already a document that everybody is, in general, in principle, agreed to. Now, of course, the outliers like Hungary, as we've been talking about, may pose a huge issue with that. So we'll see how the co-facilitators deal with that. But in such a non-legally binding document such as this, the idea is to reach consensus that everybody generally agrees to, with maybe some smaller objections in some of the particular implementations or objectives, but in general agrees to stand behind on.
Thanks so much, Colin. Stefan, I hope this responded your question. And then I have one more in the chat box from Thomas Kadavil in India. What are the mechanisms, methods, ways, and tools you would suggest for those governments who are negligent on the GCM to bring them to take part in the intense negotiations on the zero draft? And I wanted to maybe pass that question on to if we have any of the regional civil society coordinators on the line. Maybe they could advise a little bit on how they've been working with national governments. Maybe Janet from FM4 Paso Libre. I know you've been involved in the regional work in Latin America. Would you have any advice on how to reach out to governments that have been kind of silent in the process? Well, we can look a little bit into that.
Sorry, my computer is a little bit slow. Yes.
Go ahead.
Today we are going to have a meeting with the Mexican government because we are going to establish like a series of proposals. We want the Mexican government to talk about in the next round of negotiations. So right now we are working in the Latin American bloc to identify how we are going to continue to reach out to each government and just talk about our worries, especially thinking about the four main topics that are going to be discussed on the next round. So we were talking about yesterday of how we can also talk about others regions perspectives and everything in this meeting with the Mexican government. So if you want like a special topic to be put in the table, you can also like email us and we will talk about it as well. We are doing an exercise in each zero draft of just determining which are our reflections, which points we want to focus, and we are doing this by each round of negotiation. So we are really clear about what we want. So I don't know if that helped, but yes, that's how we are now.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was great. It was also a great update on some of the work that you've been doing in the region. And we'll go a little bit more in depth when we talk about civil society action and organizing later on. So I think we'll go indeed to the next agenda item now. And I'd like to give the floor to Colin Raja, just to give us a little bit more information on the process and how civil society could get involved, could participate, both in the negotiations, but I'd be really grateful if you could maybe also explain a bit on the international conference in December, or any other space where you think civil society could be involved in the formal process. So Colin, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Sophie, and thank you everybody for this opportunity. I think just to focus some of these remarks in terms of engagement, there is the formal process. So I'll talk a little bit about the formal process, which I think can be very, very confusing and tedious in terms of some of the bureaucratic details that are required. And I apologize to those who this might seem already quite familiar, having to deal with this quite a lot. But just to be clear, in order to participate in the formal processes, so anything that's organized by the UN within the constraints of the 3 phases, and now we're in the 3rd phase of the negotiations. So particularly in negotiations, looking at each month's negotiating week, how to participate, how to attend those. In order to actually even come into the building, there are 2 things that are required. One, if you have ECOSOC accreditation already, if your organization has that, then that's no problem, and which means you have like that permanent badge, the blue badge. You can come in and out and attend the negotiations freely. Or if you don't have ECOSOC accreditation, you must have had special accreditation for the GCM process, which was, open and closed about almost a year ago, early last year. So there's a list, and I'm happy to shout out the list. It's on the website of all the organizations that have been approved for special accreditation for the 3 phases leading up to the conference and adoption of the compact. If you have ECOSOC accreditation, the second thing is that you're obligated to register. You don't really have to register, but you probably should. And the registration form is open throughout the process. You should register your participants, so who you're designating in each organization to attend each round of negotiations. So obviously for next week, the deadline's already passed, but you can still go in and enter the registration form and keep entering the names for the following upcoming ones. If you have special accreditation, this is really important, then you definitely need to register. And this is in order to have the passes for you to actually enter the building and enter the space. And those who've been to the New York conference rooms will realize that the security is particularly very active there. So you really need to have that pass with you for each day, and that's one pass for one day. So if you have Monday's pass and then you lose Tuesday's pass, then you're kind of stuck and have to go to the secretariat to try and see if they're willing to print out another one for you. So you really need to have all of those passes for each day. And this is really important that you must already have special accreditation from last year in order to do that. Now, what happens if you don't have ECOSOC accreditation and don't have special accreditation? Then what many of you have already been doing is organizing within yourselves, within your networks, to see who has that and how you can be designated as one of those who will be attending on behalf of that organization that does have either ECOSOC status or special accreditation for the GCM. So this 2-part process, one, having accreditation, and then secondly, registering is really important to note. And that goes throughout negotiations. So a reminder again, please do keep coming back to the website, because that has updated information constantly posted. And if you go to the section that says intergovernmental negotiations, you can track the dates of each one. And if you go to the part that talks about stakeholder hearings, that also looks at the upcoming, there's one more hearing in May that also follows that. And that follows the same process as well. You have to have accreditation and you have to register for that stakeholder hearing, that 1 half-day remaining stakeholder hearing. Just a quick mention then about the international conference. And if you have looked at the modalities resolution about this whole process from early last year, when that resolution was passed, it actually clearly stated that there's 2 accreditations that are required. One accreditation for this process until now, and then another accreditation for the international conference, which will be in December in Morocco this year. And so that means you have to resubmit. If you've already got special accreditation, you have to resubmit everything again to be again specially accredited for the international conference. And so, and this is an application process. So it's also up to the UN, up to the Secretariat now to determine the validity of your application. But I think for most of you, that should be okay. But it requires submitting documents of your organization and things like that. So it is a bit of a tedious process, but very, very necessary to get that special accreditation. And then later on, there will be, again, a registration process for the Morocco conference, for the international conference. So again, 2 steps: get the special accreditation and register for the conference. And again, if you have ECOSOC status, that helps you a great deal because you get to bypass a lot of that. But you still need to register, and that's the process. So that's the formal process, but a quick mention also about the informal processes, and these are some of the things that are coming up already. One of the things, as mentioned, I think by Ignacio Ware at the start, is how important regional engagement is, and I cannot emphasize how critical that really is at the regional and capital level. So one thing coming up already is Tunisia will be organizing a regional a meeting for North African, Middle Eastern, and Western European countries coming up, and civil society can participate in that. So that's one of the things we're trying to see what's the mechanisms of engagement and how to participate in those. There are also meetings set up by civil society as well. That, for example, the major group on children and youth is having regional consultations on the compact. And from these regional consultations coming up with outcome statements and position papers that will be advocated by the major group within the negotiation process and with member states. So there are a multitude of ways, and the best way to be in touch, of course, is through your own networks and with spaces like this. So I'll pause right there to see if anything comes up related to the formal process especially.
Thank you so much, Colin. And yeah, indeed, maybe it's a good idea to open up the floor just for a few specific questions to what you just laid out. And I have one already. Super interesting, that information on the regional meeting taking place in Tunisia. Is there a way we can find information on that somewhere? Is that information being compiled in a central place?
Not yet, yeah. And so the thing is, yeah, the central place, of course, is the main website for the compact, which I think everybody knows by now, and refugeemigrants.un.org, and then you can go deeper into that, look at the intergovernmental negotiations and into the stakeholder side and other things like that. But a lot of these informal ones that are outside of the UN, organized by member states and all that, are not centralized in there most of the time. So on the Tunisia one, it's still in development, but I'll try to circulate as soon as we have more official information on that, try to circulate that. But I know they're already starting to reach out to some of the regional and as well as Tunisian NGOs and civil society organizations for participation. So yeah, that's very much happening led by the Tunisian government. And there'll be others upcoming as well, but really in the nascent stages of development at this point at the regional and national levels.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I'll open up the floor for just a couple of questions to Colin.
Colin, are there any ideas on when those will happen?
I think the feeling right now is we've got a huge gap between the August break into the December conference. And that was one of the concerns among member states last year when Morocco proposed to do this back-to-back with the GFMD in December. And the idea is that, you sort of lose momentum. So the feeling by a lot of member states right now, this actually gives us an opportunity to do things at the regional and national level. And I think, going back to some of the questions about implementation and review even, that not a lot, 99.99% of this will actually take place at the regional and national levels. That's why that's the proposal in the current draft of having a regional review conference every 2 years after the international conference, which is, sort of the high-level dialogue regurgitated. But, this regional conference and the regional mechanisms for implementation are going to be so critical. So the idea is that, okay, let's look at this break that we have between August and December when there's nothing going on at the formal level in New York, but actually start to think about how these can happen in the region. So the proposal right now is a lot of these will emerge out in that autumn, fall period.
And so that would be focusing on implementation, basically, presumably, because the expectation is that the actual text will be closed by then, right? So.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it won't be talking about the text itself, but yeah, talking about implementation, talking about regional issues. And that's one of the things that also came out throughout the consultations, especially in the regional economic commissions that had consultations at the regional level, that no matter what happens with the compact at the global level and what comes out of the compact, there are certain regional specificities and nuances that can be taken up at the regional level. So, and this is actually good news for a lot of us when we talk about things like firewalls and other issues that we feel are going to get negotiated down from the current zero draft or zero draft plus. If that gets negotiated down, that's no reason why a region that has a lot more work or more advanced in that might take that up and push that at the regional level. And that's very much supported, by the co-facilitators and everybody else, because, and this is the other beauty about the compact, it becomes a living document even after December and its adoption. There's a lot of things that can continue to develop in it, and the hope and the understanding is that it will grow and it will get better and better and better. And a lot of that will be driven by what's happening at the regional and national levels that take up particular issues and say, we want to do more, we think we can do more, and we have to do more around this particular issue.
Yeah, this is Ignacio. Yeah, to really entering into this discussion, just to highlight, I think, how important the international dialogue on migration end of March is, particularly this year, and with the dynamics around the global compact for migration. The international dialogue on migration this year is in New York, as several of you know. It's around partnerships for effective global governance of migration. And as we noted in the initial zero draft, I don't know about the zero draft plus, that the space for civil society was fairly reduced in a section that still has to be developed around governance. This is our chance at the IDM to get our brains together and with others to think around the issue of partnership and of civil society's place in governance. And this relates directly to the regional bodies, the regional dynamics. So I'm linking that, and just for us, as we move on working on the negotiations, not to forget the international dialogue on migration end of March, of which a number of us on this call would be participating, I believe.
Thank you so much. And this was actually a perfect kind of way to bring us into the next agenda item on civil society action and organizing. And I've been seeing quite a few questions from several of you on how we can informally engage and organize. So I think this is really the section where we can discuss a little bit of that. Like, as I said in the beginning of the call, the negotiations are really a different game to what we had in the consultation and stock taking, where everything takes place in New York, and where real advocacy really should be happening at the capital level and regional level. So maybe just for those of you who weren't so much involved in the previous two phases last year, maybe just just a quick recap of what has happened. And I'm sure I won't be covering everything, but just a glance of some of the major processes that civil society has been engaged with. So there were 5 global events in 2017 looking at preparation of civil society positioning to the GCM, and I'd like to introduce a few of them to explain a little bit what they're doing now in the negotiation round. And then, as Colin already briefly mentioned, there were 7 regional civil society consultations that took place last year. And these regional civil society coordinators or focal points are still continuing their work throughout the negotiations. We already heard Janet speak a little bit about the Bloque, which is the group of organizations moving in Latin America, but we have a few others on the call as well that I'd really like to introduce to share a little bit more of their experience at the regional level. But I think what happened in the civil society stocktaking conference was that these major processes came together, and we had a meeting right before the Puerto Vallarta stocktaking conference with about 60 organizations who were all representing other processes that had organized at the regional or thematic level. One of the documents that were developed in the course of 2017, resulting from the GFMD 2017, was the Now and How 10X for the Global Compact, which is one of the visions that have been developed by civil society to look a little bit into what could be our priorities or the main asks that we put forward to states. Of course, there's also the Child Rights Initiative work and documents in terms of specific issues looking at children across both of the compacts. So I'd love to hear also from them on this call on what you'll be doing in terms of next steps. But then specifically, I'd also like to hear from some of the more thematic work that has kind of evolved after the meeting in Mexico and Puerto Vallarta. So one of the ideas that rose after the Puerto Vallarta meeting was to divide into thematic cluster groups, really looking at some of the issues that we were foreseeing to raise some contradiction in the negotiations. And especially now with the co-facilitators putting forward 4 specific areas in the next round of negotiations, some of these cluster groups have started to really organize and try to get some language there. So Monami already introduced some of the work that's being done on firewalls. If I'm not mistaken, there's organizations also working on implementation and follow-up, and on complementarity between both compacts. And this also links me to the work of the Action Committee, which is a group of 24 organizations that organized ahead of the 2016 high-level summit to really look at how both issues relating to refugees and migrants are effectively reflected in the New York Declaration. Well, that group is now continuing its work to specifically look at what are the issues that risk to be at risk in terms of both of the 0 drafts developing. So maybe I'll start with just giving a few words of what we would be looking at right now, and then I'd like to open the floor to the Child Rights Initiative, to some of the regional focal points, and some of the people who are working in clusters. So in terms of the Action Committee, what we're looking at right now is really bringing organizations together who are following both of the processes separately, and by identifying issues that we fear are falling out of the process. Ignacio already mentioned one, which is the protection of vulnerable migrants that would not fall within the Refugee Convention, but that we find some of the governments in the negotiations pushing strongly against any reference to drivers that may cause forced migration, to extending pathways that look at, for example, situations of climate change or generalized violence. So this is definitely something that we'll be looking at as we go forward in the different negotiations. And I think we'll be very much looking at how governments now position themselves on that issue during the next round of the negotiations. But this being said, I'd like to give the floor to maybe Daniela or James of the Initiative on Child Rights across both of the compacts to talk a little bit about what you've been doing and maybe also how people can get engaged with the work that you're doing. So the floor is yours.
Thanks. Can I just check if James also was on the line, because I can give him, yes, I can see him on the list. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of what we do in the global level, for us, obviously the two key themes, well, the four priorities for the next round of negotiations are quite key in that children cut across all of them. And for us, particularly the issues around regular versus irregular is particularly important in that it affects access to services for children. It affects obviously issues around firewalls and affects much of our calls. So we will continue our kind of work using the entry point of children, which seems to have some, kind of leverage at the moment with the member states to try to also open a path for broader discussions around also adults and entitlement to access services, for example. In terms of our operational and advocacy work, as I mentioned, we are looking at reaching out to member states. So we're doing so, as I said, I was meeting with the UK yesterday. Colleagues were meeting with the government or representatives of the government in Germany. We're still waiting to see what will happen in Italy to move there, which, as you know, was a very, very important friendly state. We'll see what happens there. But colleagues are also mobilizing in Southeast Asia. And so on and so forth. So through the initiative, we are really very much looking at reaching out through also the various agencies at capital, if not regional level. And I know that colleagues in Brussels are trying to kind of, get a bit of movement at Brussels level as well. So we'll hear more on that. Just before the negotiations next week, we have a kind of a catch-up meeting on the advocacy specifically, and an engagement as well plan being drafted at the moment, looking at how we combine the various hubs of advocacy at the global, New York, Geneva, Brussels, Southeast Asia, LAC, Africa level, as well as the national level. Operationally, we have formed a group that works from New York, which brings together the reps, the advocacy reps in New York of the various agencies that are members of the initiative. James, who sits in our Save the Children New York office, is coordinating that action brilliantly with a great support from UNICEF, from Irene in UNICEF. And they are reaching out to various missions, and we'll do more of that next week on bilateral level. But James, do you want to jump in and say a little bit more of what you are actually doing from New York? I wonder if James can hear us.
You can drop him a line in the chat box, and if he wants to speak later, he can definitely add on to what you already said. Thank you so much, Daniela.
No problem. And obviously, from those on the line, please reach out to me or other members of the initiative in if you are interested in doing work or can provide any interval support at the regional and national level, that will be extremely, extremely appreciated.
Thanks, Daniela. And I'd love to open the floor also for questions to you. But before doing that, I'd like to zoom in on a few of the other processes in which people could maybe engage. And I'd like to go into the cluster groups. And I definitely welcome maybe Monami to say a bit more about the firewalls work. But I also wanted to link to the cluster that's working on implementation, since we're also getting a few questions on where civil society is on implementation, follow-up, and review. And I liked that suggestion of Ignacio, or that highlight of Ignacio on the IDM taking place in New York end of March to look at partnerships. This could maybe be a key moment where civil society also comes together to think a little bit further on this. Interestingly, I've heard from several states the direct question, since that section was so thin in the zero draft, several states have really come up to civil society asking for specific input or concrete language on implementation and follow-up. So there's also definitely some potential room for maneuver, let's say, on that area. But maybe I'd like to give the floor to my colleague Emer, who's actually in the cluster working on implementation, follow-up, and review. So Emer, the floor is yours.
After Emer or someone, I would like to say something, please.
Yes, please, Eva. I'll first give the floor to Emer, and then you can go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Sophie. And sorry, Eva. I'll be quick and definitely hand the floor over to you then.
Don't be sorry. It's important what you have to say. Take your time.
Thanks, Eva. Actually, I'll follow on a bit from what Ignacio and Colin have already said on this. I think that they gave a very useful segue into this discussion, as well as many of the comments in the chat box already, and some of the useful information and links, I think, provided by some of the participants there. So, as has been said before, in terms of the sections on implementation, follow-up, and review, in the zero draft plus, we found it really surprisingly thin, especially when compared to the other sections where there's such comprehensive content on the actionable commitments. So there is a concern that these will all come to nothing if there's no clear mechanisms of implementation at national level as well as regional and global level laid out in the compact. Also important to note, I think, that in the consultation phase and in the stock taking phase, it's not that the content wasn't discussed and brought up by the states, and there did seem to be areas of convergence amongst the states in these discussions. So it was with a bit of surprise that we saw that there was so little content and detail in these sections of the zero draft. So in terms of next week, 2 of the 4 areas under discussion will actually be on these very things, with the 3rd being on implementation and capacity building, and the 4th on follow-up and review. So as Sophie mentioned, and with others on the call actually involved in this also, so feel free to jump in, we're working on some argumentation and language on these issues so that we can bring to governments in the negotiations next week. So, I mean, there's a lot of scope to work with for the very reason that there's such thin content in the document. But some of the key messages that we want to bring and language that we want to work around will be with regards of getting language in there, as Ignacio pointed out, some language on whole of society approach, civil society there as a key stakeholder. As well as a whole of government approach, which seems to be kind of lacking in the content right now in both of the sections. And then the very big question of funding, of course, because none of this can come to pass without a clear mechanism through which it can be funded. And then capacity building is an issue that came up in real solid detail, especially in the stock taking. And so even using language that states have come up with themselves to promote that next week will be something that we'll look into. Capacity building at national and subnational level, as is already mentioned in the draft, but also regional level capacity building, which Colin mentioned is just so critical now, but also in the implementation phase of the compact. I mean, I'll leave it there, but I'm really welcoming other comments and thoughts from participants on it, as well as Eva, who I'll hand the floor to now. Thanks, Eva.
Thank you, Emer. I am glad you preceded me because I think it is very important for civil society to also focus on the connection between the Global Forum on Migration and Development and the Global Compact on Migration. There are numerous overlaps, perhaps even with the Global Compact on Refugees. And I think we need to not lose track of that. What I wanted to mention is for those of you who may not be so familiar with what we're doing, the NGO committee is one of the conveners of the Action Committee. So a lot of what has been said now is something on which we, of course, have been active. But as an NGO committee by itself, our focus with this operation has been on mission visits here in New York. We did some close to 20 before the summer break, and now we are doing, beginning in end of March, some 40 more visits. And our main objective is to find out from the missions, from the states, especially the people there who work in migration, what their concerns and positions are, in what ways our committee and those and our partners can help to and cooperate in achieving joint goals. Our focus as a committee has been on migrants in vulnerable situations, of course, including children, but not only. So we think that it is very useful to share this kind of information when we get it, also to know from other organizations what they learn from states, particularly in capitals. I know that the co-facilitators are very interested in having input, in having connections between civil society and their people in capitals. So that's certainly one direction where I would urge some of you who are in that position, and I noticed from discussions up to now that some of you have been quite active in that. And I think one of the big problems now is going to be for civil society, one, to share what their work is. That's not easy. I think we're very lucky that we are going to get Sophie here in New York. If the storm does not prevent her from coming on Thursday with her family. But she has weathered other storms, so I think she'll be here. And I think it will be very important for her to do the wonderful coordinating she already began while she was here for these last negotiations. So that we, I know every NGO here in New York certainly is already working very hard on their particular issues. But I think we need to see that we don't all duplicate one another, and that we don't overdo, and that when we do talk with states, we listen to what they have to say before we push whatever we might want to push. That's just some general observations. I hope they've been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. They were super helpful. And I think you're pointing to exactly the right questions that we as civil society are facing in this really fast process. Yes, so I will be in New York as well with the larger group of you that's already there. And I'm super confident that we'll be coordinating between the different networks and coalitions that are over there. But at the end of this call, I'll go a little bit through some of the ways you can keep updated on the work in New York, and maybe the ways in which you can share also what you're doing at the national level, so that we at least make sure that we're in sync and aware of what we're all doing. And I think this webinar, for example, is already a great way of doing that. Eva, I also wanted to thank you of sharing that high number of mission visits in New York. That's incredible. And I think maybe for colleagues who were asking about that earlier, such as Thomas from India, maybe he could even reach out to you for some intel or advice on how to approach governments, since you're so experienced. I want to give the floor to Emer for just one reaction to what Eva said, and then I'd like to go to the regions.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie, and thank you, Eva, for really that excellent. I mean, I want to echo what Sophie said about the mission visits. I'm truly impressed and in awe of you. I think it's fantastic and important work. Just one quick response to the question that you gave, just in terms of the GFMD, our organising around that and how it connects to the intergovernmental meeting to adopt the Global Compact for Migration. A bit of background for those of you who might not already know, but the GFMD this year is actually taking place in Morocco just a few days before the intergovernmental meeting to adopt the GCM. This creates a funny situation where right now we're not 100% clear on how they will interact with each other there, with the geographical as well as time proximity. But one thing that we do know is that civil society participants, many of the participants at the GFMD Civil Society Days, will be interested in engaging with the Intergovernmental Conference taking place a few days later. So whatever is decided at a government and a chair level with regards to the connecting of the GFMD and the intergovernmental meeting, I think it's safe to say that civil society and the program for the GFMD and how we will structure our days will very much be centered upon how the GCM has been shaped and how the implementation and follow-up process will look like going forward beyond December. So yeah, in terms of the civil society days, that's almost a guarantee, with still many questions to be answered on official connections between the two. Perhaps Colin has a more light to shed on that with regards to the process with the intergovernmental meeting and the connect between the GFMD and it.
No, actually, I don't. I was going to refer that to you, Emer. But yeah, I think it's a lot of things have remain to be decided. I think just a sort of a side comment on this is Morocco's position in all of this is very, very interesting. They came up very early when the zero draft was presented and said that they would be taking a neutral position throughout negotiations and also, not giving any input specific to the compact language itself. But really supporting the co-facilitators. So that's very interesting comment and position to take. And then they're hosting back-to-back things, the Global Mayoral Forum, the GFMD, and the International Conference all at one go. So I think, again, keeping that in mind and understanding how to negotiate around all of that with Morocco and the position that it will take as maybe a third kind of facilitator in this process, I think is going to be very critical. At the moment, there isn't anything very clear, and I think in the drafts we've seen that As Ignacio mentioned earlier, IBM and GFMD have been mentioned a number of times, but with not a lot of clarity in the draft yet on where this will actually fit in the implementation or review process. So that's still a question, but the GFMD will play some kind of a role. And we expect the GFMD this year to be quite focused on that part of it and relating to the compact, as well as other issues as well, but that will be a core piece of it. But and as I mentioned to Daniela, we haven't heard a confirmation of the, at least as of earlier this week, we haven't heard a confirmation of the actual venue, actual city in Morocco for the international conference. So that's still something that's been discussed, and I think that again will take into play, you know, how that fits in with where the GFMD is hosted, and as well as the Myanmar conference and everything else.
Thank you so much for that intel and information on GFMD. And I think probably a lot of it will also become a bit clearer in how governments are shaping their thinking in the next rounds. Maybe linking back to how we can keep each other updated in terms of national advocacy, I think the key way to be doing that is through the regional focal points. So those 7 focal points that have organized the regional civil society consultations last year. And these focal points are continuing their work in the regions. And I'd like to give the floor to one of them who's on the call with us right now, Pefi Kingi. So her organization has been the focal point for the Pacific region, and I'd love to give her the floor for some updates on how they are organizing.
Good evening, everybody, and or good morning, as the case may be. Down under, it is now 18 minutes past 3, so I really must have quite a bit of commitment to this, having waited quite ardently to join in the conversation and have my 3 minutes worth. Sorry, this will be 4 minutes. I do apologize. I won't see many of you or any of you next week because I won't be there. However, we will be represented by Pepe Sese or Tanuvasa, who will come through for us. Please give her and show her the same warmth and friendship that you showed me. And I have so appreciated the wisdom of the group, not only through the calls that I have listened in on, but also when I met with you in February. Thank you for that pleasure. And I have picked up quite a few things. Now, I would also welcome Vani, who is part of Piango, and she too has been extremely keen about this conversation, this dialogue, and I'm certain it will be followed up with our Executive Director, Emile. Thank you, Colin, for facilitating so that Pepe can be part of the meeting next week. In terms of what is happening regionally, the most exciting thing is that the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, which has about 18 members under it, country members, that is, they have a civil society regional forum that they are hosting. The process this particular year is slightly different in that it has been slightly competitive, which meant that we did have to apply and we did have to be appealing in what we were presenting, and what the other better topic of and priority to actually present, but that of GCM and migration, simply because our Pacific leaders do not have a regional policy per se about migration. And so this has been an extremely opportune time. I heard as Colin indicated, that the specificities that pertain to each of our regions is extremely critical, even post-conversation. But through this particular opportunity, I see that we can actually present to our Pacific leaders the start of a conversation towards implementation. and certainly there will be an opportunity to discuss funding, because there are two particular fora that we had to apply for, and one was a preparatory workshop for engagement with the forum leaders, and if we were successful, we would be invited to present to the forum leaders at a meet around about April, which will be in Palau, and also there's the Forum Economic Ministers forum that we could possibly be invited to present. The other meeting that's pertinent to us will feature in an island called Nodu that many of you may have become familiar with due to the refugees that have been, I suppose I heard somebody use the word incarcerated, which is not far different from the truth. But we'll discuss Australia at another stage. I know that there are some of you that are smiling at that particular comment, because we have spoken about that in the last month when we met. So in terms of where Pacific Wind came in, we did so submit for migration and GCM in particular to be prioritized, and you'll be pleased to know that not only were we shortlisted, but we were informed that we were successful. And so I have one of our members who will be attending that particular meeting that I'm sure Vani will be a part of in 2 weeks' time. Further to that, we know that we are keen to present to our Pacific Forum leaders, and I know that we will do a very, very good job to try to get them on side. I suppose in terms of strategies, we're still busily discussing what that could look like. So we have one of our ICT skilled persons who's going to put together a video which should look dynamic. We were thinking of doing a cultural presentation in the midst of all that, so things will be lined up to effect and appropriate to the actual forum that we speak of. In terms of processes, the facilitator has since communicated to me and indicated that they will indeed support that migration, that they will work with us to put that to the fore, and certainly to the floor, and certainly the forum. So we're really, really excited about that. So it has been a competitive process, because there are so many strategic issues, as you can imagine, that many of our members would have presented. But there you go, migration will be at the very top of the list. And what they have assessed us on has been not only the clarity of the presentation of the strategic issue of migration, but also the advocacy around it, the rationale, methodology, etc. And also their feedback to us has been extremely positive. So we're just really looking forward to making that presentation and putting it all together. But as you can imagine, trying to confer with quite a few members who are spread out all over the Pacific region, and certainly the ocean, is quite an ask and a task. So I do so admire that others, such as Eva, has made 40 presentations. That is no mean feat. But to you all, have the bestest of dialogues next week, and I am so going to miss the snow and the storms. No, I'm not. But have fun while you are seriously representing all of us from the globe. And with those few words, have a good evening, all. Thank you.
Dear Pefi, thank you so much. And this hour is indeed way too early for you. So thank you so much to have made the effort to join us and to share a little bit what the specific dynamics and challenges are in your region. Also happy to hear that you're, of course, already starting the conversation on implementation and funding, which probably should happen exactly at the regional level. So thank you for that insight. I'm super aware of the time, so I hope we can go maybe 5 minutes over for some concluding remarks. But before doing that, I'd like to open the floor maybe for questions to any of the initiatives that have presented their work going forward in the negotiations, or for any other organization that would like to speak a little bit about what they're doing at global, regional, or national level. So the floor is open.
Hi, Sophie, this is Monami. I'll just say a few words on the regions also and the clusters.
Yes, go ahead, Monami.
Great. So as I mentioned before, and then you all mentioned Emer is active in the implementation follow-up and review cluster, and I know there are others here, but we had a face-to-face meeting of the several clusters in New York on the 19th of February, where they sort of got rolling, started pressing out ideas. But of course, I think a lot of that shifted after people went into and heard the first round of negotiations. But what did happen is those working groups are active now, and so I'm sure there are ways to plug into them. I agree with some of what's been said about, I think it was Eva, that, you know, at this right now, in terms of coordinating the various networks engaged, there's a lot of layers of coordination happening. So as best as I think that the networks could work together and simplify and get inputs and share conversations and updates from what governments are saying, like what Daniela mentioned about her conversation with the UK, it was super helpful. And I'll plug you into the clusters on firewalls who are crafting the language. And I agree with the approach that Eva and others have said, that it's good to listen and hear where states are and what red lines are, and not just go in pushing, because again, I think cards are being held close all around, and we may not see really a full sort of things being put on the table until a month or two or into the negotiations. So I think we should be strategic as well across the issues. And, but the other piece of that is on the regions, of course. A lot of my role for the Global Coalition has been to coordinate those regions. So we just had an assessment call after the first round of negotiations, which had the focal points from 6 of the regions. And Fefi, I promised, and I will bring you in, because we are having there's a cross-regional strategic sort of planning space we have, and there's a lot of really good conversation that had from the leadership, particularly of Global South regions and migrant networks, and a south-to-south strategy that's I think people are really invested in. And next week, already people have gone back, and there are multiple capital visits and meetings that have happened with various members in MENA, Africa, Latin America, Asia, etc. But then coming here too, we'll be doing a series of cross-regional meetings with governments. So, understanding that the EU-Africa connection is important, we're actually going to have African and European civil society groups meet with either government, or even try to bring some governments together to meet with a set of cross-regional partners. So I wanted to put this on the table, and that's something that I think regions are really sort of formulating greater thinking on, and in a practical way in terms of supporting those governments that could be champions, maybe not within a bloc, but sub-regionally, and then providing specific good practices, examples that exist as tools. So I'd be happy to talk more on that next week when folks are here. And thanks to Colin's support, I think that all 7 of the regional focal points or representatives will be here. But that after that too, and we've talked about this, is our coalition is also committing to bringing regional members here to make sure that they're represented from those processes.
Thank you so much, Monami, for sharing that intel. And yeah, I completely forgot to mention that meeting on the 19th with the clusters. That was, I think, a really important one to get that work started. Again, I'm super aware of the time. I think I'll open for another 2 questions to the group. And then what I'll do is, so I've received this question in the chat box on having a mailing list. So we actually don't have that, but we will set that up, and we'll make it a Google mailing list so that everyone can actually share updates and information in that group. So this is definitely something we'll do after this call, and please feel free to share any other questions through that group. I'll also share the contact details for the regional focal points so that you can get in touch with them as well. So yeah, just taking maybe 1 or 2 questions more before we close.
Hello, everyone. This is Carl. I just wanted to let you know, for those of you who didn't see in the chat box, that the UN Major Group for Children and Youth are going to try to organize some consultations for children and youth now this spring and in the summer. And if you know of any youth and organizations that would like to be involved, and if you would like to help out as well with this, we will be more than happy to work with you on this. I'll post the email address that you can contact in that case as well. So yeah, we're happy to work with you on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. Any others? All right, so I think we'll end this webinar here. So we'll try to set up similar webinars throughout the course of the consultation. So we'll, of course, keep you posted on these upcoming webinars. What we'll also be doing is sharing newsletters like the one that you all hopefully received with general updates about the GCM, but also the GCR. And yeah, we'll set up that email so that we can get exchange going in this group as well. Thank you so much for joining. Let's be in touch.
Sophie?
Yes, Eva.
Just wanted, did you see that the Friday date has been changed to 9:30 in the morning?
Yes, I'm going to send an email.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you, Sophie.